Have you ever been in a meeting where no one disagrees, no one pushes back, and no one challenges an idea? On the surface, it feels calm, but something feels off. You might think it looks like alignment, but sometimes it's just silence, strategic silence. And that can be incredibly costly to leaders, to teams, and the entire organization. That's what we'll be talking about today in this episode of Leading with Instinct.
This is the Leading with Instinct podcast, focusing on intuitive leadership and fostering deep team connections through equine experiential leadership development and coaching. Brought to you by KatieTheCoach.com and the collaboration partners. Now, here's your hosts, Katie Navarra-Bradley and Ginny Telego.
Well, hi, Katie. How are you?
Hi, Ginny. I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing good, thank you. I am enjoying the sun out here in Colorado. And we had some wildfires out here a couple weeks ago, so that was very exciting and gave me an opportunity to put my leadership into practice with my horses. So we'll have to maybe unpack that in another episode.
Yes, I remember following your adventure, and there's certainly a lot to unpack in there, especially when you have animals.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, so in today's episode, Katie and I are unpacking, speaking of unpacking, a Forbes article by Benjamin Laker, a professor at the Henley Business School in the UK, titled, "Why Employees Stop Speaking Up and Leaders Don't Notice." We're going to explore a little bit how we can learn from the instinctual ability of horses to notice what's happening around them and then communicate that information to ensure that the herd stays safe. So, Katie, you shared this article with me with the suggestion that we talk about it on our podcast. So what was it about this topic that you thought would resonate with our listeners?
When I first saw this article, I thought it was really interesting just from an HR perspective. I work with a lot of HR clients, and the industry loves its buzzwords. And strategic silence was really just the latest in the HR buzzword list. And as you mentioned, the article defines this as a concern that is raised and brushed aside and a risk that is flagged by a team member and ignored. Usually, rather than answering a question with reassurance and action, people just learn to shut down and not share their thoughts, and then there's never any traction over some of those ideas. The piece that really stood out for me about this was literally the day after reading this friend's post in this article. My horse Bella illustrated this perfectly, and that's why we love to talk about horses and leadership. They make this real for us. And except that she wasn't really so silent about her message, and she left one that I couldn't ignore. She's very picky about her hay, and she may decide when she's done that there's just some stock she's not going to eat. And I thought, you're going to eat this. It looks green. It looks great. Cost me money, you're going to eat this. So for 3 days, we played this game of her pushing it to one side and me pushing it back under the feeder until I came back the 4th day and she'd pushed it aside and actually left me a nice heaping pile of manure on the hay. So that was the end of the discussion. There was no more debating. It was over. She was not eating that hay. And, unlike us, she actually made herself heard.
Well, first of all, it's just such a classic example of how we assign meaning, right, to someone's behavior. And it's interesting, when you shared that story in the context of this conversation, it made me think about, I don't know if you remember in the story of Black Beauty, and there was one of the stories within that, right, because it was kind of a broader story about smaller stories of Black Beauty's experience with different owners. And one of the stories, Black Beauty was pulling a carriage, and it was a stormy night, and came to a bridge, and she wouldn't go over the bridge. Black Beauty would not go over the bridge. And the guy that was driving the carriage was very upset and was whipping at Black Beauty. And Black Beauty just would not go over the bridge. And then shortly, within a very short amount of time, after having the driver, just really going at Black Beauty, the water came through and washed the bridge out. Mm-hmm. And that to me was like a perfect example of what happens. Like, we make assumptions about what someone is communicating or not communicating. And in thinking about it, I think we have to look at strategic silence isn't apathy, right? Bella wasn't just saying, I don't care. She was saying, there's something not right with this. Hey, and I need I'm just letting you know that. But then you made the choice of how you interpreted that, just like we all do. And so, when that keeps happening, that we're not listening, that's when it becomes a problem. And that's, I know, what we're going to talk about. Strategic silence is really it's an intentional thing, right? People are questioning whether their ideas or concerns are being heard, whether they're taken seriously. And if they decide that speaking up isn't worth the risk, they may choose to not speak up at all, or they'll speak in subtle ways, like Bella did with the hay, right? Mm-hmm. And I was reading a definition of this on Wikipedia, also talked about it as an intentional, calculated withholding of information. And I'm going to share a little bit with you later on when we're talking about kind of putting this with the horses. But I think it's one of those things we have to look at. Are there times when strategic silence is necessary? Yes, there may be information that, leaders can't share yet. But I think in the context of this conversation, I appreciate us being able to talk about it from the perspective of being able to notice what's happening.
Absolutely. And I think it's a good point, too, to also remember that we need to get to know the individuals on our team really well, because I can take some of that same hay that Bella won't eat and feed it to another horse, and he will eat it just fine, every last scrap. And, the similar is on our teams. There are some who process information differently. Some may feel they need to withhold that information or their ability to speak up because they are worried that it's going to impact their career or their ability to advance. And so when they're saying no, it's really self-preservation. They are conserving their energy, they're protecting themselves. And one of the really interesting points that was made in that Forbes article is that people who feel this way, they don't want to be labeled as difficult. We fall into that trap of just saying, oh, somebody is not agreeable, they just want to be difficult. And we want to be careful as leaders that we don't, misread that silence as disengagement or a lack of wanting to participate in the team.
Yes. And I think that is so important, The other thing that was in that article that I found really powerful and so relatable to our discussions about, the instincts of horses is it said, ask what someone is seeing, right? Or ask what is being seen that other people maybe aren't seeing. And so if you're in the leader, right, and someone isn't speaking up, then you might want to inquire about that. And when they do share what they're seeing, of taking that as a contribution of information, they're not opposing you. They may be offering information that you didn't think of. And that really struck me because I think it just relates very directly to how we engage our leadership clients in conversations about what happens with the horses in our experiential learning sessions, right?
Exactly. One of the other things that this brings up is that when somebody does speak up, it's seen as resistance rather than trying to make whatever they're working on improve, or, to your point, a blind spot that maybe somebody else doesn't see. And we do see that all of the time in the arena with horses. The horse may not move with the participant is intended, and then that participant will say, well, the horse just doesn't want to cooperate. Right. But maybe in reality, to your point, the horse is seeing something that the person is not, whether that's literally something with their eyes. Their eyes are different than ours, right? There's set on the side of the head. They have a much wider field of vision compared to our sight. And so maybe they're seeing something physically different, or they're sensing that we're incongruent, which is something we've talked about in a lot of our past episodes, that we're just not showing up the same internally as we are externally.
Right. And I think, in the workplace, that kind of that strategic silence or even dissent can be interpreted as being disloyal. Maybe they're just, we label them as negative people, or just they're being difficult. And the reality is, it might be that it's more likely that they're noticing something that they feel is important, but they don't feel safe enough to share it. And something that came up as I was preparing for this was in my work with leaders right now, I'm working especially with some leaders in big tech, and they're being asked to get their teams on board with AI, right? To figure out, how do we utilize AI in a way to, make things more efficient and improve the bottom line. And we're all reading and hearing lots of stories about companies, and it's true, companies are laying off thousands of people in entry-level positions in particular, but other knowledge-based jobs that they think they are going to just replace them with AI, and that's a whole other conversation. But the thing is that leaders who are trying to get their teams on board with AI are finding that people on their team are not sharing information because they fear losing their jobs to AI. And so they're withholding information about how AI might be able to be utilized more effectively, or to improve processes, or to do things that they do now. And they're withholding that information very strategically for themselves in hopes that it'll protect their livelihood. And so, I think there's such a broad conversation around this of why people are doing it and how they're doing it. But more importantly, and what I'm looking forward to as we're going through this conversation, is leaders noticing what's happening, noticing if people aren't sharing information, and then figuring out how to utilize that for themselves in order to build a more trusting environment where their people want to share that information.
And it's interesting that we're having this conversation now, because I recently re-listened to The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. And so when you're getting into some of these teams where there is no dissent that's shared, the meetings seem to go smoothly. There are no hard questions. Nobody's raising tough, points of view. And so a leader can interpret that as stability. At the same time, there's really no trust. There's eye rolling. There's, if you've read or listened to the book, all of the dysfunctions that come out of that. And it begins to affect revenue and really long-term stability. One of the other things, I always like to dig a little bit into the research. And so before our recording, you shared a white paper with me by Crucial Conversations that found 60% of employees admitted that they'd been holding on to a concern for a year or more. And 70% of those respondents said they had a concern that they never shared with anybody else. And
it's crazy.
It is crazy. And then if we actually talk about that in dollars and cents, the Harvard Business Review published an article in 2016 with findings that the average person wastes 7 days complaining, doing unnecessary work, ruminating about the problem, getting angry. And when they put numbers to that, it was $50,000 or more to avoid just one hard conversation. And we know there's many, many every day, many every month.
Right. Right. I mean, numbers really always speak louder than words, right? And it's fascinating that the cost of strategic silence and the associated other behaviors can hit the bottom line like that. You would think, given that information, that people would want to find a way to prevent this from happening. And another thing I think that is important in this, because it's not just about the people on your team, sometimes the leaders themselves are the ones that are practicing strategic silence. And again, it could be for a good reason, and it could be because they don't feel like they can share things that they're noticing and think are important. So they might have silence upward to their manager or the board, if they're the CEO. There may be silence around conflict or misalignment of agreements, the things that you were just talking about, that, crucial conversations came out with. And they might avoid sharing what they're noticing, even though not sharing it could be detrimental to the team and the organization, right?
Right. And arguably, the higher up the ladder you go with silence, the more costly it is. I was working with an executive recently on a thought leadership article, and we just the conversation just happened to come around to the cost of silence. And this person shared with me that when she was advising one client, they had regular executive level meetings that lasted 2 hours. Each person in that room was earning $500,000 plus in annual salary. And they were all simply nodding along, thinking that there was agreement. And there wasn't. And what she helped them realize is that just for one executive to sit in that meeting costs $26,000 per meeting per executive. Now imagine, multiplying that across 11 executives in the room. And that becomes very costly very quickly. And so really at every level, whether it's the people we're managing or we are that senior level executive or the CEO, there's real significant cost to avoiding the difficult conversations.
It is. And I think when we're looking at it from the perspective of the horses, so my colleague, June Gunter, CEO and founder of Teaching Horse, she talks about the importance that horses place on noticing. So this is something that we talk about a lot in our work with the horses, Katie, that you do as well. And June, one of the things that June talks about is in the herd, she says there's no chief noticing officer, right? Every member of the herd is responsible for noticing what's happening in the environment that might disrupt the health, harmony, and unity of the herd. And they're responsible for communicating it. So noticing it is one thing, but communicating it is the other. And I know in my experiential leadership and team development sessions, we tell clients that it's really important to say what you see, because that's what horses do to keep the herd safe, right?
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely right. I see it every day just leading my horses in or out. I can tell when their heads go up and their ears prick forward. It usually means that there's a herd of deer across the hedgerow.
Yeah.
And it made me laugh because this winter when we had so much snow, they watched me drive our utility vehicle out back. They watched me get it stuck. And yet it was like the end of the world for them. And so, they notice every little detail and they are very quick to make sure that you notice it too.
Right. Well, and this is the beauty, I think, of what they can teach us, because they probably were curious about what was happening with you with the utility vehicle. And again, I think it's a great example of the instinctual nature of horses, right? In the herd, noticing is distributed because it's a key part of shared leadership. If one horse notices something in the environment, like a sound, a shift of some kind in the energy, a potential threat, that signal really matters. And if they don't communicate that information to the herd leader, it could be detrimental to the rest of the herd. And, if a member of the herd signals danger and the leaders dismiss it, and I think this is where it comes back around to us thinking about the strategic silence, the herd then loses confidence that leadership can keep them safe. Because safety in the herd depends on responsiveness to changes in the environment. And for me, that's a direct correlation, right? If I'm a member of a team and I'm noticing something from where I am in the organization, and I'm like, boy, I think this is something we need to be paying attention to. Mm-hmm. And I go to the person who is, my manager, and I share that information, and they dismiss it, I now lose trust that person is going to keep me safe, right? Whether they're going to keep me safe in my job or, be able to do their job. And so those were some of the things that kept coming back to me. And Katie, I'm just curious, how does that land for you with, I know some of the things we've talked about in previous episodes?
Sure. Absolutely. They lose confidence in their leader if everything becomes a fire. It's like the boy who cries wolf in the childhood fable, right? But
Right.
we've also talked a lot about how horses only expend the amount of energy necessary. So when they perceive something as danger or not to their herd, they expend the right amount of energy to confirm it's a problem, alert their herd mates, and then once the episode, whatever that is passed, they're done. They're back
Right.
to they get back to grazing. And that is also a piece that I've observed in teams, even in myself, when we have these moments where we feel we can't speak up, we also spend a lot of energy allowing that to internalizing it rather than
Right.
letting it go.
Right.
And we all know that causes as much trouble in people as it does in humans when you're, or as in horses, when you're not, expending that energy and just letting it go.
Yeah, and I think that's a great kind of segue. I want to share something that recently happened with a senior leadership team I was working with, and as part of our safety demonstration, we talk about noticing what the horse notices. And so if the horse turns their head to look at something when we're with them in particular, we need to stop and look with where they're looking. We may not be able to see what they see. That happens to me all the time when with my own horses, that because we can see for a long ways, and oftentimes it takes me a couple of minutes to see what they're seeing. However, if they notice something, I'm at least attempting to pay attention to what that is. And so in this situation, so our clients were preparing to execute a task where one team member has a card with a shape on it, and they have to give directions to another team member to execute that shape while they're leading the horse. And so while the team was waiting to get started, the horse partner that was with them, one of the participants was holding her, and she turned her head to look at something. I mean, like she really turned her head, and so we all, because we had been talking about this, we all turned to look where she was looking, and it took just a moment, but there was a huge coyote just trotting towards the arena.
Oh my gosh.
Down the driveway where it's this huge horse facility. But at first the person that was holding the horse didn't notice the coyote, right? So their instinct at first was to gently pull the horses back towards them because they had a task to do. Mm-hmm. The facilitator that I was with invited the leader and the rest of the team to notice what the horse was noticing, which then the person that was holding the horse did that. And once the coyote had moved away from the arena, the horse turned back to the person to re-engage. She was fine. And the horse was okay, though, at that point, because the rest of the herd had acknowledged that she had noticed a possible threat. And the key here was that her concerns weren't ignored. And, what oftentimes happens when we are with the horses is they turn to look at something, they notice something in the environment, and we very often will just, redirect them, right? Because we have someplace we need to go. We have something we need to get done, and we're ignoring that. And I just, want to ask people to think about, what if everyone had ignored that giant, and I mean, it was big. This was a very big coyote.
What made me run away?
What if everyone had ignored that, right? What would that have done for that horse, right? It would have told her that we aren't safe to be around because we're not paying attention to the environment. And when we talked about this in the debrief, that moment, right, it wasn't even as much about the activity, which was powerful, but the thing that really stuck with this team was the importance of a leader noticing what their teams are noticing. And so at the end of the program, when we were doing our kind of, big insights, they shared that they need to be more intentional about paying attention to what their people are noticing and asking them what they're noticing, right? Mm-hmm. Because when herd leaders acknowledge what others are noticing, that's what increases confidence. And that experience was what really drilled that down for them.
I'm glad that a coyote has not showed up at one of my programs. We've had enough
Hey.
issues with them at my house and with the horses. But your story reminded me of an experience that I had with a team where the horse was very clear that it was not going to participate in the activity that we were doing. And this team was interesting. It was a mixed team. So some people did have horse experience and worked with horses, and other people had not had horse experience, but they were all part of this workplace team together. And I said to the individual with the horse experience that kept trying to force the issue, we need to be done. Like, I think we need to be done. This horse is telling us, not so silently, that it's game over. So I stepped back, and the individual continued until I was like, okay, we're done, And so when we got into the debrief, it led into a really interesting conversation with the rest of that person's team who did not speak up about potential, could there have been a safety concern? Some of them acknowledged they were not going to get the task done that they were asked. So, why not speak up? And they're a very high performing team with a lot of trust, which is also very interesting. And so they said, well, we just trusted you. We just trusted that you were going to make sure that all was okay. And they had never really met me before. And I was like, well, I'm flattered that you trust me this much. But what does that come back to in your team? And it really led into an area that they have been working on as a team, to have the courage to speak up. So even though they do share a lot of trust, there are still moments when they hold back in those conversations, and that illustrated for them where that shows up in their organization. And I always love facilitating those when they can see their own things, because they do most of the work. But it was really interesting to hear them hit on many of the points that the executives had shared with me before we went into that session.
Well, and I think that's a great example, again, of, people are looking to their leaders for guidance and reassurance, right? And leaders need to know that people notice risks that might impact the organization. But if they don't feel like they can communicate that information, that is when the problem comes out. And that's when strategic silence is not a positive thing. And, your people in your organization, they may be noticing, cultural shifts and ethical tensions. They are noticing client dissatisfaction when there's a change in a product's effectiveness. I don't know about you, but every time that something changes on my phone and they, I have to do a whole, reboot, and all of a sudden it looks different to me when I open my phone screen. And I'm always thinking, oh my gosh, why do they do that? And, so if people don't ever communicate that information, though, because companies do sometimes change, right? They will go back. Look, remember the whole Coke had something, with when they changed the recipe in that soda, and the customers were very dissatisfied. But if they had ignored, customers were telling people, not the CEO, but they were telling other people, and then if the CEO and the leaders had not listened, then that could have been really more damaging. And so, to me, the question ultimately is, are leaders acknowledging what others on their team are noticing? And that, to me, is the first step forward in moving out of strategic silence.
That really is the bottom line. Are we as leaders noticing and inviting people into the conversation that aren't contributing? Having that awareness that maybe not everybody has shared what they're seeing, or that somebody may have shared what feels like half, but not the whole piece. And that's where horses really help us as leaders, right? They respond to that incongruence immediately. They can recognize that something is off. And really, at the end of the day, silence creates incongruence. So when someone is holding back the truth, the energy shifts. The horses can sense that. And then, what do we notice? We've talked a lot about this. When the people working with the horses actually notice what the horses are and they finally acknowledge that, there is a tremendous shift back on task, right? That's what everybody likes to focus to, but back on task and back towards the goal that they're working toward.
Well, and Katie, when you just were making that comment about being at the table in the meeting and noticing, right, if someone's not speaking up. The other piece of this came to mind about the incongruence thing, because what do we often do when we do notice that maybe somebody isn't speaking up in some way, right? They're not sharing what they're noticing, and our first question though sometimes is, hey, like me, like saying, hey Katie, is everything okay? Because I noticed you're a little bit quiet today. And your response, more often than not, unless we are in a really, really psychologically safe environment, you may say, no, I'm fine.
Right.
That's all that comes to my mind is how often that happens. And I talk about that. I know I talk about that a lot in my workshops around the congruence piece of someone saying, no, I'm fine, but internally they're not, right? Mm-hmm. It's about this idea of, if I don't feel safe enough to tell you that I'm not fine, then I'm going to tell you what I think you want to hear, number one. And also, and I'm just going to withhold what's actually happening, right? And that comes back to these other things we were talking about with the crucial conversation. I'm going to internalize whatever's going on. I'm going to be thinking about what I'm noticing that maybe is important information. And I'm also going to be ruminating on the fact that I don't feel like I can tell you, that you're not going to care, that you're going to dismiss me. And so I think this is why everybody needs to have a horse in their meeting room when they're having a meeting, so that the moment that someone who's incongruent and says, no, I'm fine, or no, I'm good, then the horse can give that information to say, no, you're not. Let's all get congruent right now.
That would be perfect. Who knows? Maybe we can get little. Well, you used to have minis. Maybe we can get little minis to go back into the boardroom.
Yeah. I think it would be great.
So, Ginny, as we wrap up today, what can we leave with listeners who are leaders right now to help them maybe recognize that there's some strategic silence in their team?
Yeah, I think coming back to what we were just talking about, start listening to the silence, right? Notice who hasn't spoken up in the last few meetings. Maybe, especially if it's someone who normally does share their insights and what they're noticing. Who used to contribute but no longer does. That's important information. And, don't make assumptions about why they're not speaking up. It's important to at least engage in the conversation. They may have a good reason. Maybe they're not noticing anything. But if you don't ask, then you're making assumptions about why they're not speaking up. They're making assumptions about why you're not asking about why they're not speaking up. The other thing is, and I love this idea of thinking about changing the question. And, instead of saying, does anybody have any concerns about this? First of all, that's a close-ended question, yes or no, right? Mm-hmm. If you just ask, does anybody have any concerns? People are going to say, nope, I'm good.
Right. On to the next thing.
Right. Instead, you want to ask some proactive, open-ended questions like, so what are you seeing that I or others might not be seeing in this situation, right? Maybe you're discussing a strategic move or something that is starting to take place. And as the leader, ask your people, right? What might we be missing in this? If this fails, why will it fail? Where do we need to be placing our attention? When you can ask those kind of questions, you're inviting people to be in the conversation, right? And I think it just is important to change the way that we ask people about what they're noticing. What are your thoughts, Katie, on what people can do?
I love the reframing questions. I think back to previous, full-time experience where there was a lot of strategic silence in the room all the time. And people didn't want to answer. Everybody, myself included. Okay, the quicker we can get this over with, the quicker we can get out of this painful experience, right? And
Right.
when the questions were directed to people that weren't speaking up, they were almost like an interrogation. So reframing the questions to invite people in is a great way to start working through maybe some of that unsafe feeling that may be in the room. And it allows a bit more opportunity for conversation. Definitely better than close-ended questions, for sure.
Right, right. Well, and so we kind of talked about how leaders can, explore what people are noticing. But we also want to think about, maybe whoever is listening to this, maybe they are the ones that are staying quiet. Maybe they're utilizing strategic silence. And so, and there may be a good reason, because silence sometimes is self-protection. And so if you are someone who is practicing strategic silence right now, we would invite you to ask yourself, what are you protecting? What is it that you're protecting by utilizing strategic silence? Is this silence aligned with who you want to be? What is the cost of you not speaking out about what you're noticing? And what small noticing could you test safely? So maybe you aren't feeling comfortable enough to share all of what you're noticing, but maybe there's a small noticing that you could sort of test the waters, right? And share that with your leader and kind of be asking that question of them of, hey, I'm noticing this. I'm curious to know what you're noticing about what's happening in this project or with this assignment that we have to do, right? And I think that comes back to what you were saying with the reframing, Katie.
Absolutely. Reframing what you're noticing can definitely help turn it into an opportunity rather than a challenge. I will acknowledge in some cultures that's very difficult, right?
Right.
And I think, you have to determine, can speaking up assist in this culture and start to make a shift? Is it just me? Is the rest of the team feeling like they are safe to speak up? And if so, what is holding me back, and how can I strengthen my confidence to raise some of those? And then sometimes it could be the whole culture, and that's a whole different conversation about what you can control and want to decide for yourself. But I really like your suggestion of stepping back and doing some self-reflection on where is this really coming from and what can I influence?
Absolutely. And I think, those insights are spot on, Katie. And what are some things that we want to leave our listeners with today?
We've covered a lot, haven't we? I would say the biggest thing as leaders or as members of teams that we need to remember that strategic silence isn't about not caring, not having a good work ethic, or somebody being lazy. It is about protecting themselves, whether they're concerned about their career or how they will be viewed once they speak up. And so it's really important to understand where this is coming from. And our horses can help us remember this. As you said so brilliantly earlier, in a healthy horse herd, there is no chief noticing officer. There's not one horse that is the designated horse to watch out for all of the dangers. But noticing is shared across the whole herd. Those signals are respected because they're not, as the fable goes, crying wolf every few seconds. When something does happen, the entire herd pays attention. So safety is a collective effort. And then my favorite is once they decide what level of effort they need to put into responding, they respond as necessary, and then they expend that energy.
Right. And go back to grazing, right?
And go back to grazing. That's right. My favorite line.
Well, and I think one more question I would encourage our listeners to be thinking about is, what are you noticing right now that you haven't voiced in your environment, whether you serve on a board for a nonprofit organization, whether it's in your work environment, whatever that is. And that goes both ways. If you're in the leadership role, what are you noticing right now that you haven't voiced to your team? If you are, if you're a member of the team and, what are you noticing right now that you haven't voiced to someone else in the leadership role? Because at the end of the day, leaders who lead with instinct don't ignore silence. They recognize that it is a danger to their herd. And it's important to listen to the silence because there's a lot of information that might be in there, right?
Absolutely. I really enjoyed our conversation today, Ginny. And
this is great.
It was great. There's a lot to say about silence, which you usually think
right?
is
Who'd have thought?
Quiet. Right? So thank you to our listeners for joining us for another episode of Leading with Instinct. If this episode resonated with you, we invite you to share it with your colleagues and comment on social media. And as you are practicing noticing, stay grounded, stay connected, and always lead with instinct.
This has been the Leading with Instinct podcast, focusing on intuitive leadership and fostering deep team connections through equine experiential leadership development and coaching. The Leading with Instinct podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Collaboration Partners, harnessing the collective human potential in organizations since 2009, providing equine experiential learning for lasting change. Get in touch at thecollaborationpartners.com and by katiethecoach.com, helping entrepreneurs and business leaders reset, reconnect, and reframe to live their best professional and personal lives. Visit katiethecoach.com for more information. For more information about equine experiential development and coaching and the Leading with Instinct podcast, visit www.leadingwithinstinct.com. The Leading with Instinct podcast is available at leadingwithinstinct.com, on the Leading with Instinct YouTube channel, and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Subscribe today, and thank you for listening to the Leading with Instinct podcast.